Hello, dear students. Once again, I have come in front of you to discuss some of the important topics that are very important for your examination, for your knowledge as well. Today's topic is for MA English second semester students. This topic is metaphysical poetry, which falls in paper 6. Dear students, I know that you already have basic knowledge about what poetry actually is. Critic after critic have tried to define poetry, but no definition of poetry is final, because by the time poets want to try to define poetry, the nature of poetry changes. But to me, poetry is just the expression of the poet's different states of mood. And poetry differs from age to age. Poetry differs from sensibility to sensibility, and it must differ because literature is ultimately a product of the society, a product of the time, and no one particular sensibility, one particular emotion, one particular social condition remains the same. When these things are in a flux, so poetry or any piece of literary art, which is also a product of the same, cannot remain the same. Talking of metaphysical poetry is very important when we are doing British poetry or we are doing English poetry. This poetry falls within the 17th century English poetry, but we cannot say that all 17th century poetry is safe to be told metaphysical poetry. No, we have to judge only those poets whose sensibility appears like metaphysical poetry, in whose poetry the elements of metaphysical poetry are found. We will term those poetry metaphysical poetry. If you remember, in the history of English poetry, in the history of English literature, you must have known and studied John Dryden, a very important dramatist and poet of Restoration period. This John Dryden, in his Discourse of Satire published in 1693, refers to metaphysical poetry, uses the word metaphysical for the first time with reference to Donne's poetry, with reference to Donne's style of poetry as well. He says that Donne affects metaphysics not only in his satires but in his amorous verses, where nature only should reign, and perplexes the minds of the fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy. Dear students, if you analyze this line, if you analyze this critical discourse, you will find that a kind of philosophy has been dealt by metaphysical poets, wherein they try to digest all sorts of disparate or diverse experiences. You know that experience is very important for metaphysical poets, and this experience which has been brought within the realm of thought is all the more noticeable. Before I further move on, I must tell you the names of some of the prominent metaphysical poets. They are Donne, Marvell, Herbert, Crusher, Vaughan, Cowley, etc. And John Donne is regarded to be the leader of the metaphysical school of poetry. He has also been called as the monarch of wit. Now, what is the content of metaphysical poetry? That is very, very important. Style, content, matter or manner is also very, very important. So basically, metaphysical poets deal with love, death, God, soul, heaven, nature of man, soul of man, etc., etc. Have you ever reflected what actually the word metaphysical means, or what actually the word metaphysical stands for? The word metaphysical combines of two words, meta plus physical. Meta means beyond and physical means worldly, earthly. So all that is unworldly, all that is unearthly, all that is celestial pertains to metaphysical poetry. So metaphysical poets deal with these topics. Dear students, there is a strain of metaphysical poetry. And what is that strain? That these metaphysical poets want to bring within the fabric of their poetry the materials from the different or diverse fields of studies. They are intellectuals, they are scholars. They do not work on the wings of emotions, they do not work on the basis of emotions only. Rather, they incorporate intellectual learning into the fabric of their poetry. Fields as diverse as medicine, law, alchemy, geography, metaphysics, chemistry, mathematics, geography, geology, geometry, and so on and so forth have been explored so that they could digest these experiences within the content of the poetry. And you'll be surprised to know that the leader of this metaphysical school of poetry, John Donne, has not only written love poetry, he has also written so many satires, so many holy sonnets, so many poems of other natures as well. John Donne is a very, very important poet of this age, and he is a very intellectual personality. He has studied widely, and he is also a spiritually driven man. His opinion about God, love, death, man is very, very important. And the language that has been used by John Donne is no doubt complex, but then it requires the careful analysis on the part of the readers. Because when the metaphysical poets are learned, they also want their readers to be equally learned as well. It is not a poetry where you can pass your time. It is not a poetry which can be studied just on your journey. You are moving in a train, you are moving in a bus, and you are reading the poetry for the sake of entertainment or enjoyment. No, it is a cerebral exercise. It is an exercise of brain. So you will be surprised to know as well that religion has been explored in so many ways by George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, Crusher, and John Donne as well. Now, religion is a feeling for God, and spiritualism is your inner feeling of what actually God stands for. One may be religious, and he may not be spiritual. And one may be spiritual, he may not be religious. Because religion is an outward form of spirituality, and spiritualism is an inward form of religion. Dear students, you take one poet, John Donne, and try to understand all of his poems one by one. If you read his poem, Death Be Not Proud, you'll be very happy to have a different experience about what is his opinion about death. Death is a thing to be afraid of by so many persons, by so many people. But then, at the hands of John Donne, Death is not to be afraid of, because death is something which gives us peace of the mind and rest of the body. So, death which appears to frighten us, death which appears to threaten us, itself stands stagnated, itself stands humiliated at the hands of John Donne when he says that, no, 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 no. How can you frighten us? How can you make us timid? Because you do not give us any pains, you do not give us any tortures. Rather, when you come, you deliver us from sufferings, from tortures, from worries, and from tensions of life. Dear students, the lines of John Donne are very, very important. If you read his poem, The Sun Rising, you will come to know that there he has very, very finely expressed his moods of anger, his moods of disgruntlement at the widely and mightily respected sun. The scene is that he is still in the languor of the last night. He is sleeping with his beloved in the cozy chamber of his room. And what happens? It is already morning, and he is being woken by the peeping sun, and he loses his temper at this widely and mightily respected sun, and he says that, busy old fool, thou unruly sun. See, the great respected sun, widely respected sun, he has abused because of a figment of emotion, because of his anger. He is full confident that he need not get up. He does not need to get up, because everything that he wants to do after getting up, that can be done here in the small confine of his bedroom. Dear students, there are so many things which have to be learned by us about this great poet John Donne. And you will be well to know that John Donne was a preacher of the church also. In the role of a preacher, he was preaching about the esoteric and hidden aspects of life, man, God, and other things of unworldly affairs and metaphysical affairs. So, when we are reading the poetry of John Donne, we have to keep in our mind that his poetry is inner driven as well. And metaphysical poets had a desire. What was that desire? They had a desire to be unique, to be singular in the expression of their emotion. They wanted to express what they felt had never been expressed before. How can it be possible? How can it be possible that you will be able to say something which has never been said before? Yes, this is possible. With the help of the metaphysical conceit, with the help of the metaphysical imagery, with the help of the simile and metaphor that they have brought to bear into the fabric of their poetry. How? Because dissimilar things, two apparently dissimilar things, have been compared, and a resemblance and a close resemblance have been chalked out. The readers are perplexed that how can two apparently dissimilar objects can be similar? Yes, simile is a different thing, metaphor is a different thing. There we know that two different things are compared and a similarity is chalked out with the help of either like or as or direct simile as well. But here in metaphysical conceit, what happens? That far-fetched imagery is brought to bear upon the fabric of poetry. Two lovers have been compared to a pair of compasses. A tear has been compared to a globe. On the surface, it appears that no, there cannot be similarity between these two things. But on close analysis, we find that there is a reality and there is a purpose in bringing about this likeness. This is true on emotive plane. This may not be true on physical plane. Dear students, if you are talking about George Herbert, he has brought all his poetry to the worship of God. To him, God is almighty. God has to be respected for all that he has given us. If you are doing his poem, The Gifts of God, you will come to know that how he has expressed his opinion about the precious bestowals of the Almighty God. The Almighty God has given us a strength, wisdom, beauty, honor, pleasure, everything like that. But he has kept rest with him. Why did God keep rest with him? Why did God deny rest to human beings? There is a purpose. What is the purpose? Let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, that at least, if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. What did we know? That human beings are very mysterious. God is very much aware of the nature and behavior of human beings. How can he not know? He has created us. He is aware of each and every emotion of human beings. So he knows that if he has granted rest to human beings, they will not remember him. There will be a gap. So both should losers be. God will be loser and man will be loser. The contact between the two will be badly snapped. So in order to maintain a bilateral relationship, in order to maintain mutual relationship, he has deliberately denied rest. So whenever we are in a restless condition, whenever we feel that we are not in a good condition, quickly we are driven towards God. There is a pulley machine. Rest does as a pulley machine. It pulls us up towards God. That yes, there is some creation, there is some supernatural power, there is some superpower who is guarding all of us. Dear students, George Herbert is a very, very religious poet. His religion is different from the religion of his contemporary Henry Vaughan. Henry Vaughan is a nature mystic. He is very much like Wordsworth, but he is different from Wordsworth in certain respects. Wordsworth believes that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. But to Vaughan, poetry is not a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. To him, poetry is a kind of gift that has been conjured up through the ages, and every fabric of poetry has to be brought to the altar of the Almighty God. Henry Vaughan, in his retreat, is concerned about the lost innocence of human beings. He laments the lost glory of childhood because it is very difficult to go back to childhood. Childhood is a state of innocence. It is a state of purity. It is a state of immaculate purity of childhood. And what happens when we are growing up? The world of infancy vanishes away and the world of maturity dawns. He says in the poem The Retreat, "Happy those early days when I shined in my angel infancy, Before I understood this place appointed for my second race, or taught my soul to fancy aught a white celestial thought. And towards the end, he also says, some men a backward motion loves, but I by forward steps would move. Because why I am trying to be a child once again. The poet wants to be a baby once again. But towards the end, Henry Vaughan says that everybody wants to move ahead in life. And why am I trying to be a child once again? So poet does not want to be a child once again in form and size. Rather, he wants to attain the state and innocence and purity of childhood. And that state of innocence and purity and beauty of childhood cannot be attained. Dear students, you have to read the poem, The Gifts of God, in its totality. You have to read the poem, The Retreat, in its totality. You have to read the poem by John Donne, Good Morrow, A Valediction Forbidding Morning, A Valediction of Weeping, Canonization, The Sun Rising, Death Be Not Proud, and so many poems from Metaphysical School of Poetry as well, in order to have a thorough understanding of what metaphysical poetry actually is. You know that this metaphysical poetry is a 17th century poetry. It is at the same time a breakaway from the Elizabethan school of poetry of the previous time. Elizabethan poetry is primarily lyrical. The poetry of Daniel, Drayton, Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, they are lyrical poetry. And in 17th century there were three strains going on. The Spenserians, the Johnsonians, the Cavaliers, the Metaphysicals, the Pre-Augustans. So, metaphysical poetry chalked out a different style, and that style was unique. What was the uniqueness of the style? That howsoever diverse the experiences may be, there may be different types of emotions from various fields of studies. The poets do not get puzzled, because the poets feel that it is the duty of the mind to unify whatever is ununified. Because if you apply your mind at floods of emotions, at floods of informations, at the end of the day you will find that no, there is certain kind of unification. There is certain kind of point where reconciliation can be achieved, reconciliation can be attained. So the diverse emotions of metaphysical poetry were also the result of the character and nature of the 17th century England. 17th century England was a period of upheaval also in social, political, economic and cultural life. It was a period of moving ahead. So the poets could not remain unaffected by this also. And they delved deep into each and every emotion. Metaphysical poetry is a poetry of intellect, it is a poetry of emotion, it is a poetry of beauty, it is the poetry of the scholars as well. What happens that you take up one metaphysical poetry, you read a few lines, hardly have you gone a few lines when you come across metaphor, imagery, symbol, far-fetched imagery, conceit, metaphysical wit, you feel puzzled. There is the challenge. You need not feel puzzled. You have to consult dictionary. You have to consult your mind. You have to take everything into the account that it can be solved. If it is a riddle, your mind is a solution. Your mind can provide solution to the understanding of metaphysical school of poetry. If we are talking about Abraham Cowley was no less a religious poet than George Herbert or Henry Vaughan. Cole was also trying to understand the very mysteries of life. What is life? What is the nature of soul? What is the character of soul? And he was trying to express his inner feelings. A deep feeling has been expressed in his poetry, whether it is Saint Teresa or any other poem. And it is also very noticeable that these poets maintain an aesthetic distance also. That if an emotion is being expressed, they are also involved in it, but sometimes, as in the case of Cole, he maintains an aesthetic distance, that he does not directly express his emotion. He expresses his emotion indirectly, because the emotion in art cannot be expressed directly. It should be expressed indirectly. It should be expressed with the help of an objective correlative, a chain of events, a material, an object, and when that object evokes the emotion, then it is called that the poet has maintained an aesthetic distance. It is the theory of impersonality of T.S. Eliot, where T.S. Eliot says that the poetry is an impersonal kind of work, and the emotion of poetry is impersonal because the presence of the poet's mind is there in the poetry, but it is there in the poetry in the same way as the platinum wire is present in a chemical reaction. It does as a catalyst. It participates in poetic creation, it participates in poetic work, but it remains neutral, inert. This is the art of poetry. Dear students, in the 17th century, when metaphysical poets were writing, people were not noticing that what sort of writing is it. Some of the poets were quite ignorant that such metaphysical poets ever existed. And you will see that in 18th century and 19th century, there is no talk of metaphysical poetry, and it was only at the hands of modern poets that metaphysical poetry got revival. But before that, we had Dr. Johnson as well, who talked about the metaphysical poets. And it is very essential when we are talking about metaphysical poetry that we should make mention of Dr. Johnson, particularly his essay, Life of Cole. In Life of Cole, Dr. Johnson has a very adverse and negative impression of the metaphysical poets. At the same time, towards the end, he also has a positive favor about the metaphysical school of poetry. As far as adverse and negative comments of Dr. Johnson are concerned about metaphysical poetry, we will do well to read some of his lines. He says, metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was their whole endeavor. Oh my God, what is this? He called the metaphysical poets showy poets. He called the metaphysical poets poets whose only aim is to show their learning. They are widely read men, and their intention is not to write poetry. Their intention is to display their learning, and you know that learning is not poetry. If you are a scholar on any subject, you cannot be a poet. Poetry is something different from learning. A learned man cannot necessarily be a poet, and an illiterate man can be a poet, because poetry talks about universal human emotion. It does not necessarily need your learning. It does not necessarily need your voracious study. What it needs, it has its own domain. It has its own God to serve. Art has no purpose to serve. Art has to serve only the goddesses of art. This is the theory of art for the sake of art. Further, Dr. Johnson says that Heterogeneous ideas have been yoked by violence together. Nature and art are ransacked for illustrations, comparisons, and allusions. Their learning startles and their subtlety surprises, and the reader commonly finds his improvement dearly bought. What? He was charging that the reader has to apply lots of mind to understand the metaphysical poetry. And he was also talking about the incongruity of thought in the metaphysical poetry. He was talking about discordant cordia, means two different things have been used, two different things, apparently different things have been used to say a kind of similarity, a kind of likeness. This cannot be possible according to him. But he had done one thing very important, that towards the end he says, Dr. Johnson says that to write on the plan of metaphysical poetry, it is at least necessary to read them. Nobody can be a metaphysical poet, he says. He says that nobody can become a metaphysical poet. If anyone wants to be a metaphysical poet, he will have to work hard. And T.S. Eliot in the 20th century had all praise for this metaphysical poet. He says that a thought to done was an experience. It modified his sensibility. Because T.S. Eliot felt that diverse emotions have not been expressed in a helter-skelter manner. It has been presented in a unified way. And he also says that sensibility alters from generation to generation. Everything is in a flux. So if everything is in a flux, so this tendency of metaphysical poetry has to be accepted, has to be welcome. And anyone who says that metaphysical poetry is very difficult, he has no right to say this before he has tried hard to understand this poetry. Men like Dr. Johnson, Dryden, T.S. Eliot, F.R. Lewis, Hazlitt, and others have studied before they could pass their comment on this poetry. And we as readers of metaphysical poetry have to read each and every poem of the writers before we could comment anything on their style or nature. But we have to keep in our mind that this poet or these poets were very scholar and they had a unique experience to share. What was that unique experience? That they wanted to have a kind of singularity in their expression, because they were different from other styles of poetry, so they wanted to be unique. And this metaphysical strain is not only present in the 17th century, it was also present in the 13th and 14th century in the Italian poetry. It was also present in the poetry of Baudelaire of France in the 19th century, and in England it was present in the 17th century. So it is not something new. It is new because it has been discovered later on by the critics. So stream was always there, strain was always there. Now it is our humble task to chalk out the strain of this metaphysical poetry. We will do well when we take up any one poem of metaphysical poetry. Maybe it is The Good Morrow, maybe Death Be Not Proud, maybe The Retreat, maybe Marvels to His Choir Mistress is also very important. Thoughts in a Garden is also very important. In his poem To His Choir Mistress, you will be surprised to know that some of the cavalier strain has also been chalked out, that the poet is conscious of the fleeting nature of time, of the fleeting nature of beauty, of the fleeting nature of everything that is in the world. And in this fleeting nature of beauty, fleeting nature of time, fleeting nature of youth, he calls everyone to make the most of it. So it kind of carpe diem or catch the day theme has been explored by Andrew Marvell in his To His Choir Mistress. To His Choir Mistress is very important poem of the metaphysical school of poetry. And the last lines of this poem is very important, where the poet wants to say that if we are not using our youth properly, if we are keeping our youth or wasting our youth, and youth is not going to be retrieved. People normally think that I have to keep my youth intact as it is, I am not going to use it. Beauty is to be shared, love is to be shared. Mutual share in love is very necessary. If I love you, if you love me, you have to show your love and you have to respond to my love also. He says, but at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. Then worms shall try that long preserved virginity. The mistress is quiet. The mistress is unable or unwilling to make love. She is hesitant. She is reluctant to make love to him, to show love to him, and he is quite conscious of the fleeting nature of the beauty. That what is she going to make of her beauty? Is she going to waste her beauty, something like that? No, beauty has to be shared. It has to be utilized and relished before it vanishes away. And this fleeting nature of time has also been explored by a pre-romantic poet Gray. Gray, in his very famous elegy written in a country churchyard, has said in a very fine way, the boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty and all that wealth ever gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. Dear students, it has to be understood. Each and every line has to be understood. That what is the path of glory? It will lead to grave. We may be great men, we may be scholars, we may be politicians, we may be monarchs. But what is our ultimate goal? Our ultimate goal is to attain nirvana. Our ultimate goal is to attain to final destination. So before we attain final destination, we have to make the most of this life. So one of the significant elements of metaphysical poetry is also to catch the passing moments and to concretize it in the form of love, in the form of creation also. So how do poets become immortal? How did metaphysical poets immortal? The metaphysical poets became immortal because of their contribution to the world of poetry. And later on it was revived by T.S. Eliot. Nobody knew. Or people, if know, they had ambivalent opinion. What is he writing? So it is very important that we first go through the original text, which I always suggest to you. And before and when you consult the original text, after that you have to consult some of the critical materials. And two essays are very important to read. One is by Dr. Johnson. The name of the essay is Life of Cole, and another is by T.S. Eliot, The Metaphysical Poetry, or The Metaphysical Poets. You have to consult these two essays. Then I think that you will be able to understand very much about metaphysical poetry, and you'll be astonished to know that Ben Jonson, a true Renaissance, a true classical poet, once said about metaphysical poetry that metaphysical poetry is some things, but it will perish for the lack of being understood. What does it mean? That this metaphysical poetry has some substance, no doubt, but because it will not be able to be understood, it will perish. But now I today find that the words of Ben Jonson prove wrong, and today metaphysical poetry has been revived, have been understood, and people are making the most of it. Thanks to T.S. Eliot, F.R. Lewis, and other modern critics who have revived the metaphysical poetry. So, dear students, I think that I have gone a long way in discussing metaphysical poetry, and in my next lecture when I come, I will talk to you on another important topic. Till then, you stay at home, stay safe, take care of you, prepare for examination. Bye bye.